Hi. Okay, cool. So hi, my name is Jarrad. I'm the founder of a project called Status. We aim to create basically a private, decentralized, peer-to-peer, fully end-to-end encrypted super application, basically like WeChat without the state surveillance apparatus. And we've certainly achieved many of those goals, but not the super app components of it just yet. This talk is going to be about the reasons why I'm in crypto. I hope it doesn't come off too jaded. I've been a little bit disillusioned over the past sort of 2 years in the direction it's going in. And I wanted to remind everybody the sort of political consequences of our movement and why I'm in it. So I got into Bitcoin around 2011. I was really interested in like counter-economics, agorism, and crypto anarchy. And what I found really compelling about Bitcoin is it showed us that we could create a monetary policy and actually have it operate in a hostile environment. And it works, you know, it's absolutely amazing that is even possible. To me at the time, it still is. And was involved in Ethereum in the early days as well. And what was amazing about Ethereum is that it generalized this whole policy aspect. So in theory, you could use smart contracts to build any kind of institution. What was not clear to me at the time is that I started to recognize this as a new form of social order. And that's kind of the topic of this talk. So if you decide to leave or I end up rambling or I get cut off short because I got 20 minutes, this is usually now a long talk, the key takeaway is applying liquid markets to social orders is by far the best thing we can do for humanity. So this is not like Coder's law, this is like looking at consensus and people coming together to actually create a new social order that is not based on monopoly of violence, but on voluntary actions and enforcement of rights through protocols. So, show of hands here, who uses fiat as their primary currency in daily life? Yeah. Okay, that's not great. Who is familiar with debt slavery, this concept? Okay, fantastic. And I guess like who wants to live in a free and open society? Okay, fantastic. Well, I'm talking to the right people. So we have two problems, debt slavery, technological authoritarianism, right? This is for the developed countries. We'll get to undeveloped countries later on, or autonomous regions. So, just in case you aren't familiar with debt slavery, here is a graph of the US dollar in relation to gold, right? The value of the US dollar against gold. So in 1913, we created the Federal Reserve. This basically gave money lenders the ability to print money as much as they want and then lend it as much as they want, which is unfortunate because prior to that, money lenders had to look at their loan risk and weigh the pros and cons of that. Under this system, the fiat system we currently live in, they socialize their losses onto the currency users, right? Which basically has led to this point now where the US dollar and the British pound sterling is like worth less than 95% of its value compared to gold. The other key sort of moment here was in 1971 when Nixon basically decoupled us entirely away from the gold standard. So it's a huge problem, and it's been a problem for a long time, right? So in the early 1800s, you had the Rothschilds who invented modern finance, which is great. It really connected the world, allowed capital to flow around. But there was this tiny problem with this, right? They started to realize that lending to monarchs and nation states, these sort of people, was really profitable and also very secure. And this is a quote from the Niles Weekly Register in 1835, saying the Rothschilds are the wonders of modern banking, peering above kings, rising higher than emperors, and holding a whole continent in the hollow of their hands. Not a cabinet moves without their advice. Like, that's an enormous amount of power to have, and allows you to influence entire nations. In fact, they also invented the ability to lend to both sides of wars, right? So that's kind of scary because now they can pick and choose winners and influence geopolitics more than anyone on the planet. This is the seeds of a new social class that arise, that it was no longer beholden to their countries which they're born. They were truly global citizens, and they may call themselves the global elite today. So Hayek, Austrian economist, saw this problem and basically says, I don't believe we should ever have good money again until we take the thing out of the hands of government. That is, we can't take it violently away. All we can do is use some sly roundabout way to introduce something that they can't stop. And Bitcoin is really a fundamental expression of this. But I wanted to hold on to a concept here, this concept of opting out, right? Not trying to change things through revolution, but just peacefully creating another parallel system in which you can enact. So this authoritarianism problem, it's a thing. It's slowly happening right now. Over the past decade and a half, we're seeing the rise of authoritarian regimes, right? It is, according to the Freedom House Index, that's what's been happening. And they say China and Russia are exporting this. So, yeah. We might think, well, we lived in developed countries, we live in Western liberal democracies, we're in Europe, we're in America, these sort of things. Unfortunately, the bastion for freedom, the US, is also experiencing the same problem, right? And we can look at a few reasons why that might be the case, right? So this is about 10 years ago now, like 2013. Edward Snowden had the Snowden revelations, showed that the NSA is doing mass surveillance without any congressional oversight. And in fact, when it was taken to courts, the courts couldn't even prove that this was happening and therefore couldn't do anything, right? The ripple effect of that, though, was that Russia then introduced the Big Brother bill. China created their surveillance laws after the NSAs and the US did, so they couldn't be criticized. And then what's even worse is that the UK implemented this under the Investigatory Powers Bill. I can't remember the name of it. But that basically took everything that everyone was doing, institutionalized it, and expanded the reach of it, right? So we think that these things are like only beholden to authoritarian regimes, but these tools exist within our own societies. And this creates a massive power imbalance to anyone who's wielding this. We are living in a digital panopticon, right? So social media, for example, we're now seeing these platforms censor more and more, both due to government pressure, but also due to their own policies. Identity systems are actually conformity systems because they try to attach material rewards and punishments to your identity, which allows them to shave off aspects of your personality. If you're not behaving well, then you're economically locked out of these systems. But even in these social media systems, we're seeing that the recommendation algorithms, the news feed that you see is catered by a quote-unquote algorithm that's proprietary. We have no visibility into how this is happening, and this creates this very ripe environment or power imbalance that allows these platforms to now sway public opinion. So if you can get them on your side, you can create a massive echo chamber, you can get a whole bunch of people believing in your narratives. We've also seen this in mainstream media. So this is the Sinclair event. Basically, there was thousands of local news shows that all gave exactly the same script. And it's kind of ironic because they were saying this is dangerous to our democracy. And this is Charlotte Iserbert. She was a senior policy advisor in the United States Department of Education. She was a whistleblower on the Project BEST, I think it was called, where basically UN change agents were looking to decouple the children from their parents' influence and, in her words, prepare these children for a socialist collectivist future world, right? And this is funded by the Rockefeller Foundation as well as the Andrew Carnegie. Super fascinating. She goes into a lot of the details on the psychological methods, and the chances are if you went through a public education system after 1970, you were exposed to some of these techniques. Population engineering, right? So now we're getting a bit more serious, okay? So population engineering, like, I don't know if you're familiar with the Uyghur problem. Well, I guess China, CCP views as a problem. But genocide now is a lot softer. We can do it on a slower pace, and in the abstraction of doing that makes us less responsive to it, right? So, and we do this through mass sterilizations. This mass sterilizations is not unique to this particular problem. China applies it to their entire population under the one-child policy. And this was informed from the United Nations. There was a bunch of books that were going around. Basically, the idea is very Malthusian at its core, but it's not unique to these authoritarian regimes either. If you read, is it Rockefeller's Population Council? No. And Henry Kissinger's report, you actually can read like how this is attempting to be applied by this upper social class globally. It's super fascinating stuff. And this is more prominent in the sort of public venue of this called the World Economic Forum. There were some tweets showing that this is a possibility of the future and this is their intentions. These were all deleted because there was public outcry. But there is this agenda pushing this forward where they will be able to provide for all of your needs, which sounds very utopic to me. Klaus Schwab is quoted saying, "The notion to integrate young leaders has been part of the WEF for many years. I have to say, when I mentioned some of the names like Angela Merkel, Vladimir Putin, and so on, they've all gone through this program. We're very proud of them, like same with Trudeau, so on and so forth." He also went on to say that half the cabinets in some of these countries are influenced by the WEF, right? And so this is a huge problem. Like, we like to think that we're living in these democracies or these democratic principles, but there is an active effort to subvert them. It's just the case. Davos 2022, right? Our industry is not immune to this. They are viewing like what we currently have today as like shadow crypto finance, right? And what they hope to do is capture everything that we're doing and integrate it into the dominant banking industry. The Master Switch is actually a fantastic book on like how this pattern constantly repeats itself in technology. But it's not unique to that, so it's a bit cut off there, but like supranational organizations such as the IMF and who was it? IMF and World Bank and so on, under the COP26, are trying to reorganize the global financial system and make it a cohesive whole, right? This means that you don't have these different systems in different nation states with independent jurisdictions, but are now becoming part of a global regulatory framework, which is also being defined, and will not be in line with at least my ideals. So what do we do, right? Albert Hirschman has come up with this ultimatum that we have with the state. He was actually using it for consumer choice, and it's called exit, voice, and loyalty. And basically, you have three options. You can exit or opt out, like you do with Bitcoin. You can express your voice, like protest, or you can be loyal to the system, right? And each of these have like a cost and reward associated with them, right? And so you want to be, in an ideal, fair governing system or social order, you want all of these to be as low as possible and the rewards to be as high as possible. Under Voice, Mika White was one of the co-founders of the Occupy Wall Street movement, also protesting this debt slavery thing, and basically wrote a book saying protest doesn't work, you know? Then it was revealed that the FBI with the DHS, local police, and the banks had worked together in coordination to take down Occupy Wall Street and treat them like terrorists. So FBI documents have just obtained partnership. I'll skip these slides. Yeah. Now, interestingly enough, another thing happened that isn't often talked about, but at the end of 2012, it's September, is when Occupy Wall Street ended. The New York Times activated a whole bunch of propaganda, basically turning this whole tension, this class tension against the 1%, into a racial tension. And it just started using its clout and influence to start pushing all of these narratives. These are sourced from LexisNexis. There's like hundreds of them that show this repeating pattern. Now, we can't prove this is the case, but I think that it's worth reading The Grey Lady Wink to understand the influence of New York Times and how it's tried to influence ideologies and public opinion. So this whole opting out idea, right? Like, so we have Bitcoin as an example, but here in Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia, There was Ivan Juras and Václav Benda, right? Basically the forefathers of this idea of the parallel society or parallel polis, right? Their ideas were to essentially escape from the communist regime by creating these parallel structures. So here's a quote from Ivan Juras: "If it proves impossible legally to compel the ruling power to change the ways that govern us, and if for various reasons those who reject this power cannot do or do not wish to overthrow it by force," I don't want to do that, "then the creation of an independent or alternative parallel society is the only dignified solution." The independent society does not compete for power. Its aim is not to replace the powers that be with the power of another kind, but rather creates this power beside it, to create structures that respect other laws and in which the voice of the ruling power is heard only as an insignificant echo from a world that is organized in an entirely different way. And this ended up being the source of inspiration for Václav Havel to overthrow the communist regime. And I mean, I'm bastardizing this because I'm short on time, but you get the picture. But this idea actually goes back further. The Jewish diaspora in Poland and Lithuania had actually recreated their own version of a state, a theocratic organization that was based on like ancient Israelite organizations. Because they were in host countries and they wanted to manage their own affairs, they created these kahals or kahilas. Super fascinating stuff, right? Like it's now showing that this idea of a state is possible without being bound to a territory. In fact, this idea has also been developed. Like I remember reading Crypto Anarchy, Cyber States, and Pirate Utopias in my teens, right? It's like 20 years ago now. Not only from crypto-anarchists or cypherpunks in the past, but also statists or policy designers were also thinking about virtual states. This ability to create governing services that are fair and competitive, that operate without this territory aspect of it. Barlow, rest in peace, said, we will create a civilization in the mind of cyberspace, maybe more humane and fair than the worlds your governments have made before. Leslie Lamport, 1989, published the Paxos protocol paper, right, called the Part-Time Parliament. He referenced a fictional legislative consensus system. Basically, these merchants that would come to this island recognized that they needed governing services for themselves, but all of them wanted to continue trading, right? So they didn't really want to get involved in politics and deal with administration. And so what they ended up doing is when they came back to the island to trade their goods, they could also participate in the system, get the latest updates, come to consensus, and basically have a social order that was based on voluntary interactions and didn't require this monopoly on violence. And this is really interesting when we come to this point of exit costs as well, when we talk about blockchains, because you can fork these systems. So if you are no longer interested or ideologically aligned with the blockchain community that you're in, you can literally just replicate everything and just start anew. And wherever it was deployable before is instantly deployable in the new instance. It'll change market value, there'll be some disruption, but the point is that the exit cost is much cheaper. Right now, your ability to exit from the governing services that you have requires you to literally physically move yourself into another country, right? And people don't live in the places they live in purely for their governing services. They have families and their lives, basically. They might even be born there. So I've been talking about our societies, the ones we're very privileged to be in. But actually, our technology doesn't really apply to developed countries, in my view, because we have functioning legal systems, we have functioning financial systems, we have good institutions, comparatively speaking. But Kachin is a proto-state that has been fighting for independence since the 50s, right? They can't have buildings that have paper-based systems in them. They can't have real property registries because they get bombed by the Burmese, right? And they suffer from what's called the natural resource curse. The Kurds in Rojava also have a similar problem. They're trying to establish a democracy in the Caliphate of ISIS. They get bombed by the Turkish, and they have terrorists on the other side of them. The ability to create a resistant system, as long as you can maintain like some infrastructure, like mesh networks, for example, would allow you to coordinate these systems and even back them up globally. And we can do this a fundamental good in the world just by using the technology as it is today. If we can only secure property rights, we're going to be helping 4 billion people. Right now, they're locked entirely out of our white economies, right? They live in these shadow economies predominantly. Now, there are some issues that we have to solve, right? Like energy, and some countries already have smartphones, even for very undeveloped countries. The other reason this is like actually worth doing is because the World Bank themselves had identified the value of institutions as being the largest share of wealth in virtually all countries, right? That means it creates more value and more wealth to do this than it does to extract resources out of the ground. Like, it's absolutely phenomenal how much this is actually worth. And even if we don't do that, even if we just make forms a little bit easier to solve, right? We're reducing this idea called transaction costs in the abstract sense. Like, you don't want to be like waiting in a line all the time. Every time you're doing that, like, time is money. You're like burning it. And the Copenhagen Consensus had actually realized that a mere reduction of 0.1% in transaction costs quadruples a country's wealth, which is the difference between Argentina and Switzerland. It's absolutely insane to me, right? So we can actually distill the best practices we've learned in history for provisioning governance services into essentially 6 items, right? The respect for consent. How am I doing for time? Okay, so the respect for, yeah, these are all very large topics. But the respect for consent is super interesting when you start thinking about it in terms of the nation state. Because the nation state actually has a terrible argument for its consent over you. You probably haven't actually signed the Constitution, and certainly not in some kind of mandatory binding way. At best, they have this sort of implicit consent over you. Whereas in a blockchain social order, you are quite literally explicitly transacting with it. You could explicitly sign a constitution that's associated with it to even access these networks. And this is like so fundamentally important because you are now proving that you are beholden to, I don't want to say that necessarily the coercive rules, but you're voluntarily entering into these agreements and respecting their outcomes, right? Currently, I'm just born into a country and I have a whole bunch of like laws that I'm beholden to, you're beholden to. I bet you don't even know what they are. And that's actually this point here, clear and fair interpretive rules, right? Like, I have no idea what laws I'm actually under right now. So the American Law Institute had implemented a thing called the Restatements of Common Law, which is super fascinating. They basically took all this case-based law, they distilled it down to these single black letter rules, and it's still quite large, but it's manageable. Like, if you as a citizen wanted to understand exactly what the laws are, you can read these things and go, oh, okay, that makes sense, now I get it. The issue is that it's under copyright, right? And they will enforce their copyright. So we need to emancipate that in some way. And I have a project for that. This idea of independent adjudication is also really important. We're all kind of used to like this monocentric law. We have a court system that's like basically our state. We might have some small centers of arbitration, but fundamentally we're stuck with this monocentric law. Under a polycentric or autocentric system, or smart contracts, you can actually independently choose who is going to be your arbitrator and what system of rules you're going to be under. Yeah. But what we build and how we build it also matters, right? We need to build a sovereign stack, which means It can't be done by a VC-backed company. It needs to be public. It needs to be done by a collective or a DAO. I don't really like to use that term as much. It needs to have disintermediated access. Like right now, we're using JSON RPC interfaces from our wallets into these systems, particularly in Ethereum, which completely defeats the purpose. And like, if you have a nation-state adversary that's coming after you, or the citizens of this social order, that's like a fundamental, it's fundamental need. Same with network-level privacy. If you are transacting on these networks and you're using, say, Tornado Cash or something that's private on there, it doesn't really matter to a passive adversary because they can see exactly where you've transacted from. In fact, if you're doing it through a JSON RPC, MetaMask knows exactly what they're doing, what you're doing. We need to separate the data availability problem into decentralized file storage. We need to have heterogeneous multi-chain networks. So these state systems, or these network states or crypto states, we want to have local communities with their own set of rules, right, or their own social orders. We also want them to be able to split off if they need to. The other aspect of this is we need private smart contracts. This doesn't really exist yet. I mean, Jordi Bellina's project under Polygon, the ZK EVM, is probably like the best one that actually exists today, and I think will hopefully come out this year. And it needs to work on resource-restricted devices, right? Like any incentive system or infrastructure that ends up reinforcing centralization again creates a massive problem unless we create our own territories. But when I talk about a crypto state, it's not a monolithic concept in the same way that the internet does not exist. The internet is a relationship of nodes and edges. And when we talk about crypto states or these network states, we're talking about stateless societies, or at least the thing that we can get closest to in our generation. The institutions live within this network. So, from my perspective, I think we need a movement to create a self-sovereign crypto network, a decentralized technology stack that maximizes the cost of surveillance and coercion while minimizing the cost of exit, voice, and loyalty. We need to create a template for self-determining communities that follows best practices in providing governing services, distributing non-coercive justice to all. Together, we can construct a network state. I've been working on this concept with a small group of people for a while now. If you are interested in these ideas, please hit me up on my status, and I would love to chat with you. Thank you very much.